Not long ago, if you wanted to make a video game, you needed a massive studio, hundreds of developers, and hundreds of millions of dollars. The big publishers controlled everything: what got made, what got marketed, and what got played. That's slowly starting to change. The price of computers has gotten so expensive that the average gamer might decide to skip upgrading their GPU or skip buying a new console. When your audience can't afford the hardware your game requires, you have a problem that no marketing budget can fix. A lot of these studios become so big that the people making the decisions stop being the people who make the games. Developers lost their voice. The studios got taken over by businessmen who have never touched a controller in their entire lives. And this isn't just an observation. At GDC 2026, the games industry's biggest annual conference, developers said openly that the trust in ownership and management is plummeting. One developer put it plainly: their track record is dog shit. Two-thirds of developers at AAA studios reported their companies had layoffs. 28% of all developers surveyed were laid off in the last 2 years. When the person in charge doesn't understand what makes a good game, you get bloated development cycles, office politics, and products designed by committee.
And personally, I think the game team is more valuable than the game itself. So treasure that team, nurture that team, give them the autonomy to keep taking care of the players. Because the thing that made the game special in the first place was the people who built it.
These companies stopped listening to the people who actually play their games. Instead of building community, they built walls. Developers who wanted to engage with players got buried in red tape. Creative decisions got replaced by metrics: what's selling, what's trending, what's safe. When your game is designed by a focus group and a spreadsheet instead of people who love games, it shows. The result: another sequel, then another, with slightly better graphics and a familiar title on the box.
Or doing something in an existing franchise or a sequel or things like that. But it does over time become, kind of unsustainable. And I think that's what AAA has really been grappling with a lot.
And these price hikes don't just affect PC gaming. Every console needs the same advanced chips and silicon that are getting more expensive by the year. And now these same companies want to charge you $100 for that experience. On top of figuring out how to add a pay-to-win mechanics or subscription models or DLCs, gamers are trying to get their money's worth if they do decide to buy a AAA game in a tough economy. Which means for the first time ever, smaller teams and even individual developers have an advantage against AAA companies like they have never had before. The playing field isn't even anymore, and it's only going to get more uneven from here.
It's usually these smaller independent studios that are winning all the game awards, right? And I think on the upper end of the industry, kind of, I don't even know what letters we use anymore, but I'll just say AAA. At that end, things have gotten more expensive. The teams have gotten bigger, and typically, I think the products have become more derivative too.
Older retro games aren't just surviving, they're growing. And a lot of them aren't just good for their time, they still hold up to this day. These games weren't trying to keep you subscribed. They weren't designed around retention metrics. They weren't made to be fun. Turns out, fun doesn't have an expiration date. These games also run on a potato or an old console. The retro gaming market hit $3.8 billion in 2025, growing at nearly 3 times the rate of mainstream gaming. 2025 outsold 2024 in retro game consoles by a whopping 32%. People aren't going back because they're nostalgic. They're going back because the games are better. Then there's the modding community. This is where it gets really interesting. 3 of Steam's most played games right now started as a free fan-made modifications. Counter-Strike started as a Half-Life mod. Dota started as a Warcraft 3 custom map, and PUBG started as an Arma 3 mod. Combined, they've generated billions in revenue and launched entire genres that didn't exist before. Skyrim has over 60,000 mods. Some improve the graphics. Some add entirely new storylines and characters. There's a volunteer team right now remaking a complete separate Elder Scrolls game inside of Skyrim's engine for free. because they love the game that much. Minecraft's modding ecosystem has generated 350 million annually. Baldur's Gate had 22 million mod downloads. 40% of its player base used mods, and games that support modding retained players 64% better after 2 years. After 5 years, that number climbs to 90%. 28% of professional game developers today started their careers as modders. The community built what the studios forgot to, and they did it for free. So while AAA is drowning in debt and laying off the people who actually make games, the industry is thriving. In 2025, indie games generated 4.5 billion on Steam alone. Not total revenue across all platforms, just Steam, just indie. In 2006, there were only 12 indie games released on Steam all year. In 2025, that number hit 10,658. That's not a trend. Indie games are becoming more and more common. And one of the biggest reasons for that is co-op gaming, a market that AAA companies have almost completely ignored, and indie games have been quietly dominating it. In 2019, co-op games on Steam generated 3.5 billion. By 2022, that number climbed to 6 billion. By 2025, it hit 8.2 billion, a 9% increase over 2024, the highest co-op revenue ever recorded on the platform. That's not a trend. That's a decade-long shift in how people want to play games. And here's what makes that number extraordinary. The 3 best-selling games on all of Steam in 2025 were Repo, Schedule 1, and Peak. They're all indie, they're all co-op, and all made by small teams with no $100 million marketing budgets, just games people wanted to play with their friends. Repo, a co-horror game, sold 14.4 million copies, generating 113.6 million. Schedule 1 sold 8.2 million copies, generating over 126 million. Peak sold 7 million copies. Helldivers 2, which started as a mid-budget title, sold 11.8 million copies. On Steam alone, generating 370 million. Split Fiction generated 104.5 million. Arc Raiders crossed 12 million copies across all platforms. Only one game in Steam's entire top 5 revenue earned as of 2025 didn't have co-op, and that was Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. Every other top performer had cooperative gameplay built in. Here's why AAA can't replicate this. At $10, a copy of 4 Friends can jump into Repo for $40 total, less than the price of a single AAA game. And because these games are built to run on almost any computer, nobody has to upgrade their hardware just to play with their friends. 83% of developers, according to the 2026 Unity Game Development Report, are now prioritizing online multiplayer. 64% of small studios say market conditions have led them to focus on smaller, more manageable projects. The industry itself is voting with its development resources. As the Alinea Analytics put it, cooperative mode has transformed from an option to an essential part of the gaming market. Not everybody wants to play grueling PvP games. Co-op offers gamers the chance to socialize and have fun without stress. AAA spent years chasing live service games and competitive multiplayer. Meanwhile, indie saw a goldmine in co-op, a niche totally untapped by AAA. But the numbers only tell part of the story. Let's talk about the games themselves. Clair Obscur Expedition 33, a team of about 30 people, not a major studio, not a $100 million budget, a small French team that built something that rivals the best-looking AAA games on the market right now. It sold 1.8 million copies on Steam in its first month, and it kept growing through a pure word of mouth. By the time most people had heard of the game, it had already sold more in May than it did at launch. Grinding Gear Games, a group of Diablo 2 fans, were tired of waiting for the sequel they always wanted. So they stopped waiting for it and built it themselves. Path of Exile is now one of the biggest games in the genre. They didn't have a publisher. They didn't have a marketing budget. They had a community that wanted exactly what they were making. Friday Night at Freddy's, one developer, built out of a frustration in a bedroom. The game became a cultural phenomenon and is now a movie franchise. One person with an idea that resonated with millions of people that no focus group or committee would have ever greenlit. And then there's Stardew Valley, one developer, 4 years of work, 30 million copies sold. No publisher, no marketing department, no live service mechanics, just a game that people loved and they told their friends about it. These developers weren't trying to justify a $1 billion budget. They were designed around the retention metrics or quarterly targets. They were making games they actually wanted to play. Now, some people will say the indie market is getting saturated. And honestly, they're not entirely wrong, but they're asking the wrong question. In 2025, around 20,000 games were released on Steam. Only about 300 of those earned more than $1 million. The median indie game on Steam earns between $5,000 and $15,000 in its entire lifetime. Half of all indie games earns less than that. Steam releases 70 new games every single day. So yes, if you make a low-effort clone and throw it on Steam, hoping to get lucky, you're going to struggle. The market is brutal for that kind of game, and it should be. But here's what those complaints aren't telling you. Indie games generated $4.4 billion on Steam in 2025, a 21% increase over 2024. That's a 25% of Steam's entire revenue coming from indie games. The top 5 indie releases alone, Schedule 1, Repo, Peak, Hollow Knight, Silksong, and Escape from Duckhoff, generated over 500 million combined. 5 games, 500 million. Steam hit a record of 42 million concurrent users in January of 2026. The eyeballs are there, more eyeballs than ever before. They're not just looking at everything equally. Games that launch above 90% positive reviews get the algorithmic flywheel, word of mouth, visibility, discovery. Games below 70% get an algorithmic silence. The market isn't saturated for good games, it's saturated for bad ones.